Peter must have felt pretty good about his idea of forgiving others 7 times. I think he probably said it fairly boldly to Jesus. How many times must I forgive? 7 times? I'm quite sure he didn't think he was going to have the response he got. No, 77 times, answered Jesus. 77 times. My, what an odd expression. Are we to count then how many times we forgive? No, of course not. But what is the meaning then of this passage, these famous words of Jesus that are sometimes interpreted instead as 7 times, 70? Wow, even more. They need to be put in context. That's how we are to interpret them. We are to place them in the context of perhaps what Jesus was calling Peter and the hearers and we who hear this day to recognize and to understand from the Old Testament. For as Douglas Hare says in his interpretation commentary on this famous passage from Matthew, Jesus was probably hearkening back the hearer to the words of Lamech in Genesis chapter 4, verse 24, where Lamech so boldly says to his wives, "Anyone who hurts me, I will avenge them 77 times. Revenge or avenge them 77-fold. Or as Jesus says, forgive them 77-fold. What a balance. What a balance. Unconditional revenge in one story. Unconditional forgiveness in our morning's gospel lesson. But what is it to mean for us today? How are we to put this into practice? This unconditional forgiveness. For me, it's always a lot easier if I can draw on some present-day illustrations of someone who maybe lived out the gospel lesson I'm looking at to preach upon on a given Sunday morning. And so when I learned that I would be preaching on this particular scripture lesson, I was drawn back to a movie that I had seen a number of months ago. The movie of Philomena Lee. I hope some of you might have seen that when it came out, or perhaps have already read the book about Philomena's life. But for those who haven't read it, or for those of us who need some reminding about it, let me, in my own words, paint the story for us this morning as a portrait of this unconditional notion of forgiveness. Philomena Lee, as a young woman, became pregnant out of wedlock and needed a place to turn during her pregnancy and through the birth process. And so she turned to a convent where she lived in Ireland. And there was welcomed in so that she might be cared for and give birth to this child. As the story unfolds, you see a rather difficult situation in which Philomena is not exactly treated well by the sisters. In the process of giving birth, in fact, she is giving birth to a breech baby. And in the movie version, at least, one of the sisters says, give her anything for the pain. Let her deal with it in response to how she has gotten here. The baby is born, a little boy. And in the context of the sisters opening the doors to these women out of wedlock, they encouraged the women to stay for a period of years, to help in the life of the convent, to help repay the generosity of their care and their support through the pregnancy and through the early raising of the child. And so Philomena was there in the convent for a period of time, raising her son, whom she named Anthony. Until one day, when she learned that it was his day to be adopted. Adopted by a family, as it turns out, from the United States, who had come to pay for this child. And another, a little girl, who would be taken then by their adopted parents back here to our country. Over the years, Philomena had tried to solicit information from the sisters of the convent about what had happened to her son, Anthony, because she was troubled. She wanted to know, was he well? Had he found a good home? What kind of a life was he living? He was born in the 50s, and so across that period of time, his life would have continued on in growth. She wondered, was he called up to Vietnam? Did he die there? Was he well? Was he able to find employment as he grew older? And so on and so forth. But each time she inquired, she found that she was told there was no way for her to be given information. So the story, as it goes, really heats up later on in her life. Her daughter, from her marriage, finds out that indeed her mother had had this child out of wedlock, and that the mother was longing to reconnect, to find out what had happened to him. And so the daughter, with compassion, happens to meet up with a reporter, Martin Sixsmith, who happened to be, as it were, sacked because of some political issues from the job that he had there in London. So he was sort of at odds end, and so it was good time for him, in a sense, to be coaxed into helping Philomena find her son. So as the story shares the consequences of this birth out of wedlock, Martin goes with Philomena back to the convent to find out what he can discover with her about where this child has gone. The sisters once again put Philomena and this time Martin off, saying, "There are no records, we cannot help you. In fact, the records have been burned." But they didn't give up there. They left the convent and they went forth and began to make plans to find a way to discover where this adopted child had gone. As it turns out, the young man being adopted by this American family had grown into a mature adult by this time and had in fact graduated from law school and in fact had at one time lived here in Washington, D.C. I say at one time, because by the time Philomena and Martin got to the U.S., her son Anthony, whose new name from his adopted family was Michael, had passed away. So the reunion was not to take place. But Philomena didn't give up at that moment. She decided she and Martin were going to continue to pursue answers about whether he had ever thought of her or the homeland he had come from in Ireland. And so over the course of a period of time, they began to meet friends of Michael's and ultimately met his partner, who revealed to them that, yes, indeed, Michael had longed to know more about his birth mother, had longed to know more about how he had come to be a part of this family in the U.S., what had become of him during the time of his birth and ultimate adoption there in the convent in Ireland. As it turns out, Michael had pursued his mother quite a bit and information about her. And as it was revealed then to Martin and to Philomena, the mother, the convent did not tell them that, in fact, Michael was buried in the cemetery outside the doors of the very place that Philomena and Martin had begun their search for Philomena's long-lost child, Anthony. They returned to Ireland to pursue this. Martin, of course, looking for the best story he'd be able to write from a human interest perspective, but Philomena to find out where this grave actually was and to finally be able to go there and bring some closure to the pain in her life, the loss in her life. They once again get to the convent and are put off into a waiting area. Philomena patiently beginning to wait, while Martin, charged up by all this information, bursts through the private quarters doors into the section where the sisters were staying and looks for the eldest of the sisters in order to confront her about the conspiracy the convent had been hiding. The tension, of course, is rising at this point. Martin is becoming furious as he confronts the nun about this lack of willingness to tell the truth to this woman seeking information about her long-lost son. Only to have Philomena burst through the doors to ask, what is going on in here? Why is this shouting and yelling going on? Martin, why are you confronting her? As the story wraps up, Martin is trying to incense Philomena, to show some anger towards these sisters who have kept this truth from her and from her son. But Philomena instead turns to the sister and says, I forgive you. I forgive you. This, friends, is an example of unconditional forgiveness. But like so many other persons, Martin exemplifies the ongoing anger and rage, the desire to kind of get even for all of this. And he continues to retort back, at which point Philomena turns toward him and confronts him and says, look at you, all angry, Look at you, all angry. I can't be bothered with this. Forgiveness. Unconditional forgiveness. That helps us to understand this passage in this way. The word used here is also a word that can be translated move away from, forego. Move away from what? Forego what? Probably the balance between what Jesus was talking about, revenge and healing, revenge and forgiveness. Forgo the revenge, embrace the forgiveness. Move away from the anger. Embrace the healing love of God offered in forgiveness. We live in a tough world. A very tough world, where forgiveness sometimes is very hard to do. If we think of it as simply a personal sort of thing rather than a transformational sort of thing, as Jesus invites us to do when we forego revenge, when we move away from continuing the cycles of violence that are so often a part of this tit for tat. This you hurt me, I will hurt you. This evil has been done to me, therefore I will do this to you. I'm going to share one more brief vignette of something this passage brought me back to thinking about. It's about another woman who lives here in Washington, D.C. Recently on Facebook, a lot of us have seen little postings about listing 10 books that have stuck with you. Well, for me, one of those books is called Revenge by a woman by the name of Laura Blumenfeld. She was a reporter for the Washington Post at one point. She has a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University. And when she was a newlywed in 1998, she decided she was going to write this book on revenge, because so much of the world revolves around revenge. And so she spent a year studying it. She met with the person who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin. She met with Netanyahu and questioned him. She went to Albania and met with a blood feud council member. And she ultimately spent a lot of time during a year she spent in Israel then researching this book with the family of a Palestinian man who had shot an American rabbi in 1986 on the streets of the old city of Jerusalem. In her work with the Palestinian family of the young man, she spent a lot of time trying to understand why he had done it. Was he targeting individually this man? Was he taking outrage in some fashion against the community of Israel? Was he retaliating for some personal injury? Was it something corporate? She spent a lot of time with his family, and she spent a lot of time communicating with him through letters while he served in prison for this shooting of this rabbi, who, by the way, had lived because the bullet had gone high and only grazed his skull. But along with learning about all these aspects of revenge and what motivates people, she began to learn a lot about this family of this young Palestinian and about him. But her time in Israel ended and she returned to the U.S. only to learn that he was going to be given a hearing to see if he might be released after 13 years in prison, because his health was beginning to fail him from asthma. And so she thought she should return to Israel and testify at the hearing about what she had learned about him and about his family and about the tragedy of how this young man had been pulled into this kind of revenge act. And so she returns, but remarkably not by herself, but with her mother, who happens to decide that she should come along and not have her daughter go alone. And so they get to the hearing, which is only supposed to be the opportunity for the three judges that are hearing the case to hear the lawyer of this young Omar, the Palestinian shooter, who is there to present his health case before them. But Laura finally talks through the process with the prosecutor to say that she wants very much to be able to be heard by the judges. And so as it turns out, she's allowed a few minutes to speak to them. And she begins to tell about her story about finding out a lot about the family and about him, and how she believes that he's sorry, and that she's met also and talked with the rabbi who had been injured in the shooting, and he believed that if this young man was truly genuinely sorry, he should be perhaps released because of his medical condition and the fact that he had served a lot of years by then, 13 in total. But the judges become impatient with this, thinking she really is only sharing hearsay information, and so they try to quiet her and put her back in her seat. But she plows ahead and continues to speak even as they ask her to sit down. And as she continues, she reveals the truth of what had motivated her in the first place to look at revenge. That she, in fact, was the daughter of the rabbi whom the Palestinian young man had shot. So she did, as she said, have reason to speak because it was personal to her and personal to her family. And she believed that she had something to offer about the transformation that was taking place because they had seen each other finally face to face in the courtroom, but through the knowledge of knowing one another as people, through the year of letter writing. But the story doesn't end there. Up stands her mother in the rear of the courtroom and shouts, "I forgive him. I forgive him. And if the whole Blumenfeld family can forgive him, can't the state of Israel?" Seeing in the world that there sometimes is another way frees us to be transformed, even when terrible things happen to us and our first reaction is, I want to get even. I want to take revenge. And Jesus empowers us in the community of Christian life. To each and every day, consider transforming our actions in the world from that of a reaction of revenge to that of a reaction of forgiveness. Think today of just how powerful a message that is for us in the here and now. If we can but claim a way of transforming ourselves in response to hurts and injuries, so that one step at a time we can begin to transform the responses we have to each other and to the healing of our world. Standing in this pulpit today, aware that Dr. Martin Luther King preached his last sermon from here, I am awestruck by the power of the gospel in our present day and age, and the power of this balancing story between taking revenge and acting out for justice and peace, forgiveness, healing, and transformation, foregoing the eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth mentality that so often motivates our world in ongoing stories, epic stories of revenge. Again, I see in recent weeks an example of foregoing this. In Ferguson, Missouri, where people marched with arms up, surrendering, foregoing acts of revenge so that they might move for justice but not return evil for evil. Now, not in all walks does that happen, or there wouldn't have been Molotov cocktails thrown or gunfire heard during those marches. But if we can be at the forefront of the kind of thing that says, yes, you can confront injustices, as Jesus encourages Peter and others to do, both in the church and in the community, we can begin to move toward transformation, toward letting go of revenge, and toward walking toward the kingdom of God, exemplified in the forgiveness of God to all of us in Jesus Christ. Today, as we end this time of meditation on this gospel lesson, I am quieted because of the news reported on the front page of all of our morning papers about the young British man beheaded by the ISIS terrorists. It causes us all to pause in the face of evil. It causes us all to pause when we wonder what kind of response should be made. There must be justice. But the justice must come not as an act of revenge, if we are to follow the message of this gospel, but as an act of foregoing and moving on, not forgetting, not acting in a way that releases perpetrators from what they do, but in a way that transforms our response to the message of the gospel. The gospel messages through the lectionary readings build one upon another. And back on Labor Day weekend, The epistle lesson of the day from Romans talked about do not return evil for evil, but give thought to what is good in the sight of all. So as we look for ways to prevent evil, let us also embrace ways to transform our response in the community of God's people to a response that gives thought to the common good of all. Foregoing revenge and moving into the transforming work of justice for all. To God be all the praise and glory, now and forevermore. Amen.